Wow. Thank you to each and every one of you for choosing on your own something to share. I wanted to do it this way. We had discussions on how this night was going to go, but it's very informal and loosey-goosey, as you can see. I'm glad that we heard a little bit from each of you of what mattered to you and how that informed you as you went forward in your creative lives. So now we're going to get into more of the mechanics of the stories that you tell, how you chose to tell them. And these questions were kind of formulated by a combination of Minsu's expertise and his great selling job to all of you to read the books and his intimate knowledge of each one. And I approached my questions to you from just downright curiosity. As a television news reporter, I only get about 90 seconds to talk at a time, and usually that's with notes. And so the idea of going beyond that to a horizon that to me seems kind of unreachable, and really mining your own experiences and sharing it with others is kind of a scary thing. So I really appreciated what you said, Chung, about how hard it is, but how happy you are. So I'm going to start off with Patti and your book, Sorry to Disrupt the Peace. And my first question to you is, if you all recall, there's a tragedy. It starts off very quickly with a tragedy. A woman has lost her brother to suicide. And she has to go back home to her childhood home and to her parents, and she confronts a whole host of issues and feelings and a lot of unresolved issues. So in telling your story, Patti, even as you show your characters in their most private moments, you keep the reader at a certain distance and never quite reveal what's going on in their minds. Is that sense of alienation something that you see as particular to your characters, or is that a commentary on life as a whole, something that's universal about all of us?
Well, I guess I think the book is mostly situated in the narrator's mind. She's herself is very alienated. She's a Korean adoptee. And that experience is one of being kind of like in between, like you're not really Korean, you're not really American, you're just like constantly, I guess you feel like you're just kind of like a visitor passing through. So I think it was from that feeling. I can't make a claim about the universal. I wouldn't feel comfortable doing that. Yeah.
Helen Moran is the character who lost her brother to suicide.
That's right.
I've read other interviews that you've given where you made it very clear that while there are symmetries in the book to your own life, that it shouldn't be read as autobiographical.
Yeah.
Was that important for you, for your readers to understand?
I think it's something that, I was very surprised by that conflation between the writer and the narrator, how quickly that occurs, how still my book is described as an autobiographical novel, which I've never said, based on my name, what I look like, my family, people make all kinds of assumptions. So for me, I find it a little troubling, a little problematic.
And yet this book is so different from your previous writings, which have been characterized as fantasy-like, fable-like. So how have you come to master in your own way these two different storytelling ways? Because this is very interior. Helen Moran has this. There were times when I read parts of your book and I felt like there's vertigo. I'm going down a rabbit hole and I don't know where this is going. And you have to almost guess, but then she comes out to these conclusions that are very explosive and very hard to take sometimes. So how do you pair that with your previous writing style, and how did you come to get to the second?
I wouldn't say I'm a master of anything. I think it's just, I think it comes from being a rather anxious person and somewhat obsessive. So those two things, I channeled those into the personality of the character, but it's definitely at an angle, like an odd angle. It's like not direct. It's not directly me, it's a character. So and as far as my other writing, that was like a style that I honed in graduate school. I was trying to impress my advisor, so.
Thank you for your honesty. finally, since this is your first novel, any big lessons or learning curves that you would share to others who are thinking of venturing into the publishing world?
Yeah, I think you have to be very flexible. There was like a printing error with my book. There were like thousands of copies that had like some kind of smudge on a certain page. And because I'm a little OCD, like I started to have like kind of a mental breakdown. And it's just a smudge and it's not even there. It's like it turns out, it's in like 80 copies out of whatever. So it's not really a big deal, but at the time it like overwhelmed my life for like a week. My partner threatened to break up with me multiple times. So I would say just to be flexible.
Thank you, Patti. Jimin.
Yes.
So, A Small Revolution is your first novel.
Yes.
Your work deals partly with a common experience for Korean Americans, that of the strangeness rather, that one feels in returning to Korea or visiting a place that you haven't been to in quite some time, and you're coming back to it as an adult. What inspired you to use that as the basis for a pretty harrowing story that you tell about a friendship that's gone really, really wrong in the course of shifting from one country to another?
This is the part that's autobiographical. I went to Korea in 1985, and I was perplexed. I was just really confused by what I was seeing, and I didn't understand enough Korean to understand what I was hearing on the news, and I don't think the media coverage was very accurate, and so it just stayed in my mind, and I always thought that I would want to write about it. I also felt like there was a lot of my cousins here, and my brothers when they went. I felt like they didn't understand it. And it was. I just wanted to explore that a bit. So I sort of filed it away and thought, when I write a book, maybe I would. I did some research on it. I tried in the 90s. There were a lot other books published about it in terms of what had happened in the 80s and in the 2000s. So it was always sort of something that I was trying to understand. And then we saw some incredible things happen in Korea, with the presidency of Kim Dae-jung, and so I just thought that was really remarkable, and I wanted to do that. And the other part of the story was just something that fascinated me. I thought, at the time it used to be a rare occurrence to have these kinds of situations, these violent situations, and so I'm sorry now to see that it's more common. And it just sort of came together like that.
That's a theme that I think we'll return to with probably still to come. The pacing in your book, it's quite obvious that you go from this very tense, dangerous situation right off the bat at the beginning of the book, and then it stops and meanders into these flashback points, and you come back to the current crisis, and then you go back again, and so the story goes back and forth on the timeline. Was this something that you planned to do from the outset? Was it something that you had help in crafting? Did you have advice that this is a way to tell the story?
Right. I have a great writers group. Some of them are here tonight, and so so we help each other with ideas and things. I think this format came up because I had exhausted all the others. It takes me.
So there were other permutations of this story.
Yeah.
Okay.
And you could see, even when I was starting to read my thing, it takes me forever to get going. Stop, start, stop, start. So this was actually an interesting way for me to try to get all the different pieces that I wanted to get in to this story. I was writing some flash fiction at the time, and it's something that they use in Flash. And these characters kind of came up again, even when I sort of put the book away and thought, it's not working, and you shelve it. And then, and so I was writing a flash story, a short story, and I was trying to do it in the segmented way, and they just came back again. So then I just tried it as sort of just a last-ditch effort, really.
So how long did it take writing the book? And I kind of see you possibly using, I'm a very tactile person. I have to use Post-it notes. I'm also really good at show and tell, which is why I get paid to do what I do. But I can't imagine taking too long. I would not survive that process. So was it a long duration for you?
Yes, but then you write other things, you sort of put it away, and so you have other things that you work on, and that's like when I was working on the short story, it was a chance to do that, and you just kind of, there are a lot of, it's a happy life, like Jung said, but it's also terrible. It's a terrible life. Like really, it's like a curse. It's really just, it just can be awful. So you got to sort of have other things to do and just like keep doing it, because when you're in the process of doing it or after you've done it, it seems better than maybe some of the other things.
Well, at least the book was good company.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Min Jin, your book, Pachinko. As a novel about ethnic Koreans living in Japan, a prominent theme is displacement, including the displacement felt by members of a minority in the only homeland they have ever known. So how did your experiences as a Korean American serve you in exploring this? And was the theme of displacement necessary to summon empathy for your fictional subjects?
Oh, that's a good question. You know, about displacement and about my role as a Korean American, and everybody in this room, in a way, can understand this experience of this outrage that we feel when things are not fair. And I felt a lot of rage as a young person. I mean, and this rage was so uncomfortable because nice Korean girls are not supposed to be angry. I mean, every fairy tale, every myth, every story is about sacrifice and being submissive and being good for the greater, giving up things for the greater good. And yet I knew there are things that are really wrong about when I was growing up, and I didn't even know how to articulate it. And perhaps that could explain some of my silence when I was a younger person. Because, you know, when you are a child of an immigrant, and I came to America when I was 7.5, it wasn't like I said, I want to go to the US. It was because my family wanted to go, and they had very specific reasons. My father's from the north, my mother's from the south, which means that my father lost everybody when he was 16. He was a war refugee, and then my mother was from Busan, so she lost her entire family when she decided to come to the US, and she didn't really want to come to the US. And we were very poor, so it was difficult being poor. And as I got older, I started to meet more wealthy people, and I realized they're really different than I am. They have more money. And money can give you more access to things, so I was really concerned about that. But to answer your question, I think that my sense of outrage, and it's very funny, I'm 49 years old now, and I don't feel that angry anymore. I'm really amused. Like, most things are really amusing, and I wonder if Minsu and I can agree on this, because we're both historians by training. He's a real historian, I'm just like a fake historian. I studied history in college, and I always wanted to kind of become more like Minsu, literally, like to get a PhD and to become a history professor. And it was really too hard, so I decided I'll go to law school. And Don, isn't law school easier than getting a PhD? We have a famous lawyer here. Anyway, so I decided that I would go and be a lawyer, but going back to the sense of, and by the way, when you're a lawyer, you're always actually kind of pissed at everything. Yeah. Don's like, I'm pissed right now. So, and this sense of indignation gets translated into your labor. But I want to talk about this one point, because this is the only thing that all of us in this room share, I believe that all of us share, is that we feel this sense of outrage because we know that things don't have to be that way. And we know that because we get to live in America. And in America, things are not perfect. Boy, are they not perfect right now. However, I'm allowed to say that right now and not be dragged off to jail. And I think that's a beautiful thing. I can talk about the Cheetos head and it's okay. I can say that the Muslim ban is immoral and I will not be jailed. I mean, all these things make America so great. So go back to your question is about displacement. What caused me to focus on this story? It's primarily because I was so pissed as an American. And I knew that it was wrong that the way the Koreans were treated in Japan and the way they're treated even today. And I knew that I had to speak about it, but artistically speaking, it couldn't be just a tirade against the Japanese, because that would be completely inaccurate history too. My husband is half Japanese, my son is a quarter Japanese. They are not responsible for the plight of the Koreans in Japan. The modern Japanese person is not responsible. However, I wanted to talk about it, and that sense of outrage translated with art and with storytelling is truly the American legacy that I got to have as an American citizen.
Having published 2 books now, what was your very first serious writing attempt, and how, if at all, did that material inform what eventually became either books that you have out today?
Oh, it's another really good question. You know, gosh.
Like, can my high school diary be something publishable eventually? That's really, that's where I'm coming from.
Actually, your high school diary probably. So it's funny that you mentioned high school, because I was thinking about the stories that I want to tell today. For the past couple of weeks, I've been thinking, like, what is it that I want to talk about tonight? And I've been really kind of like narrowing on this. And I should share that when I was in high school, my father had this little tiny disgusting store on 30th and Broadway where there are like rats in the basement, and I had to work through all the time. And I spent almost all of my college and high school breaks working at this store, at this kumonkage, this like teeny tiny store. Anyway, but the important thing is that one day at Bronx Science, there was a little ad that said the Korea Times was looking for people to write essays in English. There was like a little section called the Korea Times English Edition, and they were open to Korean kids coming in writing essays. So I wrote something, and it was published. And then I wrote a couple more things, and it was published. The Korea Times was my first publication. And I remember in this little tiny store, and the store is smaller than this stage. It's smaller than the stage, and it was freezing. And the son of a bitch who was a landlord would never heat the place. My mother was freezing all the time. We had to have space heaters. And my mom, she's a very proper, nice girl who went to Yonsei, who studied music. She was always wearing skirts, and it'd be really cold, and my father would have to wear several sweaters. But in this little teeny tiny desk, he would cut out the Korea Times essays, and he would put them on the wall. I know. And I remember thinking, with all of my social blundering and quiet and weirdness, like, I had done something. I had done something. Did that mean that I was going to be a writer? No. Because I wasn't paid for the Korea Times, so I knew it was like a vanity project. Right? Because those bastards didn't pay me either. So But I will say that when I was in college, I wanted to write more, and I was trying to explore, is it possible for Korean American immigrant girls like me to become a writer? So then I took an Asian American literature class, and then I read a book by Teresa Hak-Kyung-cha called Dictee. Phenomenal work of art. And it turned out that she was murdered violently after she published her first book. And then I read another great book by Run Young Kim called Clay Walls. Again, phenomenal. And she died of cancer, like not shortly thereafter. So I was thinking, this does not bode well for Korean American women immigrant writers. And then, of course, I took the LSATs. True story.
Thank you. Grace. Everything Belongs to Us is a story that takes place at a pretty crucial time in South Korean history, a year before the assassination of President Park Chung-hee, which will be followed by another coup d'etat by a military strongman. What did that historical moment mean for you that you chose to have your novel take place at that time?
Okay, so I tell this story out of a respect for truth, even though it makes me look terrible. I was 19, I was a sophomore at Yale, and I thought I knew everything. I'm like the smartest person that ever lived. No one can tell me anything. My parents can't tell me anything. They're boring. And so I was trying to decide whether I should be an English major or a lit major. Like, you know, this is like earth-shattering decisions, right? And so I said to my dad, you know, I'm trying to make this decision. Can you tell me what it was like for you to go to college? And I don't understand how I got to be age 19 and never asked my father what it was like for him to go to college. And I thought he was going to tell me that, you know, he majored in history, which he did, and that he, you know, played paduk a lot or something, you know. What he ended up telling me was that actually he didn't have a very normal college experience because half the school year the campus was closed down because the students were protesting, and etc. So I still remember, I'm 19 years old, I think I'm so smart. And I said, why are the students protesting? What for? And he said, they're protesting for democracy against the president. I said, so then why was the campus shut down? Because the president was a dictator. And I was like, South Korea, you know, the land of my birth, and I have such happy memories of growing up, you know, in South Korea. I actually said to my father, are you actually talking about South Korea or North Korea? Like, you know, I asked him, like, your memories, can you locate them on the map? He said, no, South Korea was not a democracy when I went to college, which was early 70s, and did not become a democracy until 87. So I'm doing the mental math, and I realized, like, holy shit, like, I was born in a dictatorship. Had no clue. I thought, you know, we moved to the United States when I was 6 in 86, and obviously I noticed differences culturally, socially, even economically, but I did not notice the political differences because I was just too young at the time. And by the time that I caught up, you know, because, you know, you get to, you're at age 6, you're old enough to realize, like, you're traumatized. And I was traumatized. I didn't speak English. I wanted so desperately to understand what everybody was doing. I couldn't understand. And so I think by the time I caught up to, like, American culture, I was like 12. And then by the time you're 12, you're like trying desperately to like get into college and get away from your parents. And so it didn't catch up to me until I was 19. And then by the time it caught up to me, I was so ashamed of how deeply ignorant I was about a culture that I thought I knew everything about, because I grew up in Bergen County, New Jersey, which is not the highest number of Koreans in America, but the highest density. So Palisades Park and Fort Lee have the highest density of Koreans. So 51% of Palisades Park is Korean. And so in my world, everybody was Korean, everybody was Christian. I was so tired of it, to be honest, that I just didn't want to know anything else. And then when I realized there was this whole other history that was deeply important, influenced my parents' life and generation, influenced my life, because the way they were raised informed their worldview, which then informed my worldview. And suddenly I realized, this is why we're having problems. So I need to understand this history, and I need to understand it deeply. So I wrote the book.
The 3 characters in the book, they all have they had their own personal definitions of glory, right? So how do you go about defining those voices, finding it? Do you talk to yourself in a recorder? Are you talking to yourself in the shower? Do you ensconce yourself in a room? Do you find a noisy cafe where the din helps you to find those voices?
I don't know if it's because I didn't understand English for a while, and so naturally, I think I'm a naturally outgoing person, and I used to be as a child, and then I came to America and I became very introverted and very shy because I just couldn't understand what was going on. And then it took me, I think, probably close to 20 years to like return to my maybe normal, natural self. And so during those 20 years, I was very quiet, and I listened, and I read everything I could get my hands on. And so hearing those voices was not a problem for me, because it, you know, even though what was hard was the research and trying to imagine a time period that I wasn't even alive for, but those voices of ambition and what people want and what they're willing to do to get what they want, I thought that was very contemporary. And so this was something that I was seeing in my generation, at the time I was writing was 2011, and so these were all very post-crisis, post-Arab Spring, like these are very, very vibrant voices, and so I could set them in Seoul 40 years prior with no problem at all.
My last question to you is, you mentioned these current events issues that were happening at around the time. So did anything happen in your life or in the news that you heard that helped you to change the arc of the story, that contributed to details that you felt were good tools and instruments in telling it?
I think it was encouraging because I don't think that any one thing changed or diverted the arc, but it was encouraging because I saw that, I don't know what year it was, that the protesters, the activists were the people of the year on Time magazine. And so I had reached critical mass in my project, so it wasn't like I was not going to do it, or it wasn't like I was thinking about doing it and then this happened. Like, as I was deep into the project, these things were happening. And then, of course, with Park Geun-hye being president, I was like, oh my God, like, I have like a bookend, a natural bookend for what's happening.
Yeah.
And I think, so she was impeached March of this year, and my book came out in February. And so I just felt like I had natural pegs that I could hang this story on, but it happened kind of, like I felt like I was riding the wave a little bit, but it wasn't behind me. It was like I was following the wave, so to speak.
Okay.
It was helpful.
Thank you, Grace. Chung, Shelter.
Oh, sorry. No problem.
Shelter was a book that took you many years, right?
Yes.
I think generally that's not surprising, but in your particular case, it was more than 10?
Yes. From the first idea of it to the writing of it and completion of it as a novel.
So how did you tackle it? From day to day, year to year? I mean, what was your relationship with the writing process?
It came in sort of violent fits and spurts. Yeah, that's not a good word. That's not a good word for it. But it did come in fits and spurts because I tend to write to images. I just kind of come up with something and then I try to work backwards into a story. But I was in graduate school when my parents started talking about retiring for the first time, and that just seemed very odd to me because they're very young and still they're very springy. They're always hiking. They're more active than I am. And it just seems strange to think of them as being retired. So I think I came up with an idea of like this Korean man seeing his elderly mother walking toward the house naked as sort of a symbol of an adult feeling sort of inconvenienced by their aging parents and things happening at bad times. But, that was all I had. And then, years passed and then years passed. And I would just go back to it. And it was 2007 when there was a case in Cheshire that I know that you covered as a journalist that sort of got me thinking about the book in a different way. But yeah, I think it took a really long time because I simply didn't know what question I was trying to answer. And in general, whether it's a short story, whether it's a longer work, I use writing as a way of working out questions about things that I don't understand.
So the story that she's referring to is the Pettit family tragedy, where a man, his wife, and 2 daughters were violently attacked. In the case of his wife and daughters, they were killed by 2 men they did not know who broke and entered their home, forced the wife to go get ransom money from the bank herself, right? Mm-hmm. It was just horrible. And the aftermath of that included a court case. And to this day, I was telling Jung this earlier, it is one, I've covered a lot of tragedies in Canada and here in the US, and that is one of the worst. Nothing has really come close to that. And maybe you can describe what it was about that, because I read in interviews that you've given that there was a little bit of a gestational push, shall we say, in helping you to get going with the writing because that story helped to summon certain questions for you?
It did. I think that particular case, I live in Baltimore now, but I lived in Massachusetts, which was about 90 miles north of Cheshire, Connecticut, where this crime happened. Baltimore, DC, New York City, home invasions take place every day. They typically happen in neighborhoods that are poor, that are black, and we don't hear about them a lot. But we heard about that Cheshire case a lot because it was a very affluent white family that was sort of a pillar of the community. And as you mentioned, the father was the only person who survived the events of that night. The two men who were responsible for this crime set the house on fire when the police were starting to close in on them. So the father was the only person who survived. And I just remember thinking, like, how does a person wake up the next day or wake up the next year or wake up 10 years afterwards and know that he lost his loved ones that way and to know that they died so afraid? Like, I couldn't get over the idea that that happened to him. And I also couldn't get past that question, like, how do you overcome that kind of violence? So that was sort of like the push, unfortunately, that the book needed. And I started sort of pondering the larger question of, like, what if an act of violence happened to a family that had a history of violence? Like, what happens then? So those ideas started to cohere in about 2007 as a result of what happened in Connecticut.
And then the writing process picked up for you?
No.
No.
No. God.
It wasn't hoping for a nice, clean conclusion.
I know. Like I said, it's hard. The crime took place in 2007. The case ended in death penalty convictions for both of the men in 2009. Those cases have since been overturned in the state of Connecticut. But they will spend the rest of their lives in prison. I started writing the book and thinking of it as a book in 2010. And from that point on, it was after the trial was over, and it took about 3 years from that point.
So, not to give away anything in the book, there is violence in this seemingly perfect Korean family, violence that happens from without and intrudes in a terrible way that causes I guess, friction then, a literal like coming together of the generations that the main character had not really wanted or foreseen. But you touch on something that Min-soo had described as sacrosanct earlier. It's just not something that we question as a community. And from generation to generation, this gets passed down. Was that your intent, to kind of peer into this darker corner of the Korean American family and force a conversation about it?
It wasn't necessarily my intent from the outset, but I did want to create a Korean American family that felt real and whole and honest and deeply flawed. I think that what I remember being a kid growing up in North Dakota is that we just always had to be so damn perfect. Like, people couldn't see us unless we were perfectly dressed, perfectly groomed, unless we had all of our stuff together. And I think that talking to immigrants, not only just from Korea, that is something that they also grew up with as an experience, feeling like because everyone was looking at them, because some people didn't necessarily want them here in this country, that there was this pressure to be so perfect. So I wanted to create an imperfect Korean American family that has a hard time telling the truth to each other, telling the truth to themselves.
Okay, well, that concludes the Q&A session from me. Thank you to our writers. How are we doing for time? Okay, we can open it up to the floor for some quick questions, and I encourage everyone to stand up. We can't bring the mics to you because they're wired, but maybe you could stand up and just project and direct your questions to whomever you'd like. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you guys for coming. So I have a question, but I should probably preface this by saying I'm a Korean American. I grew up in Oklahoma, and so it was a very interesting experience. And I've always loved reading, but I don't think I realized until recently that every classic American novel is about like a 16-year-old white guy who can't get enough abs. You know, that's a big So it's all in LGBTQ community. And so I started reading things, started thinking more, and I realized, wow, like the norm of a classic American is so white, it's so white, straight male. And do any of you see that changing, especially given the political climate? Do you see something at least being introduced in schools, or the norm changing about what it means to be American?
I want to say, as wonderful, So, as wonderful as this is and as rare as this is, it's still just a drop in the bucket. I don't think there are enough writers being published. There's still not enough diverse voices. And so I don't see that changing. But maybe there is more awareness all across the board in these conversations. And I think that that's actually that's really important.
Well, I remember the first writing class I ever took was taught by a Russian American who immigrated to the United States in the early 90s when she was 18 and she was a political refugee. And so she said to me, she was so funny, and she said to the class, she would say things like, oh, well, pray, if you guys ever put a book out, then, the year that you put your book out, another Korean American doesn't put a book out in the same year because there's only room for one. And all of us have put books out within probably 12 months of each other. And I say this, that's awesome. But then, this year, the National Book Award, in the finalists, there were 2 Asian American women. Not only, and when I see that, and one of them, of course, is Min Jin, when I see that, it gives me, I just want to pound my chest in pride, because I was told, when in my very first writing class, after I finally worked up the courage to take a class at Gotham, by a minority woman who was struggling just like me, and she had put out her book to acclaim and all of this stuff, but very sardonically she had said, just pray that you're that one, but the door is getting ever so slightly wider. And on the podium, there's a little bit more space. And so I'm not going to say, problems are solved and now we can go on our merry way. But I also want to say, how great is that, the increments are still increments. We should be happy. I mean, we shouldn't be satisfied, but we should celebrate.
We have time for another question?
We do. It's 9 o'clock right now.
It's 9 now, okay. And
We started a little bit late, so
Yeah.
we'll go a couple.
okay, so we'll take a couple more questions. Yes, at the back. Yes. Yep.
Hi. So this question is for Min Jin. So in your first novel, Beautiful Millionaires, you wrote such amazing and complex Korean American characters, and one of them, spoiler, but I think it's important to say, has an STD, and that's the first and I think only portrayal of a character with an STD that I've ever seen in any novel, especially a novel featuring characters of color. And so my friend Wendy and I, we really love you and we love your book. That you chose to write about something that doesn't get talked about nearly enough, especially in Asian American communities. We're so reluctant to talk about health problems in general, and especially sexual health problems. And I wanted to ask why you chose to do that.
What's your name? What is it? Christy, what a pleasure to meet you. Thank you so much for your question and your comment. It means the world to me because I started to write in 1995 and I published my first book in 2007. That's 12 years for those of you who are strong in math. Pachinko was written, I got the idea in 1989. It was published, I know, this year. And by the way, I don't work in fits and starts. I work all the time. And if you follow me on Instagram, you know I work every day. I work like a poor immigrant, and I'm proud of it. But going back to your question about why did I write about illness, I write about illness as a metaphor, but I also write about illness because And as a metaphor, I want to talk about the communicability of illnesses, because very often Asian Americans and Korean Americans are seen as a contaminating influence. And in Japan, they are certainly considered as a contaminating influence. So illness works in a metaphor in that way. And the other reason why I wrote about illness is because when I was 16, I gave blood at the Bronx High School of Science in a blood drive because my friend asked me to go. And I'm very compliant. And I gave blood, and then the Red Cross wrote to me and said that I had a chronic hepatitis B carrier status, so please never give blood again. So that became not as a metaphor, it was literally that I had a sexually communicable illness. I also had an illness in which I could kill somebody if they were vulnerable to what I had. And I remember thinking that I had to have these conversations very early on as a young person. And then I got very, very ill when I was in college. And at Yale New Haven Hospital, Dr. Rubin said to me, when I got very ill because I reinfected myself, that I would get cancer in my 20s and in my 30s. And very likely I wouldn't get an organ transplant because when you are carrier status, and many, many, many Asian Americans are carrier status, they are not candidates for getting a liver transplant. And by the way, spoiler, I am perfectly well now. I'm entirely well. I had a 6-month interferon B course, and I have been fully cured. I get tested all the time, and I'm perfectly well. But then I realized that this power of shame is so incredibly horrible. And so in Pachinko, there's also a very strong discussion of AIDS and HIV, because I interviewed a lot of people in Japan who have HIV and AIDS. And again, they're considered to be a forsaken people. And I think one of the things that I want to do as an artist is to think about a new world in which we can talk about things like a communicable sexual illness. 1 out of 4 Americans in this country has herpes. And then one of the things that I learned when I did research on herpes, I even did all this, there's like a whole like North Carolina research triangle, and they publish all these documents about herpes. And I learned that you could get herpes from having a blowjob from a person who has, simplex 1. And I didn't know that. And I thought, you know what? I learned this thing and I didn't know it, and I thought I was pretty sexually savvy, so I'm gonna put it in my book. So that's my public service announcement. And I said the word blowjob in this room. How cool is that?
Another question? Yes.
This is not a question. My name is Wuertz, and I'm a painter, and I'm 65 years old. And I feel like, wow, my kids made it to Harvard or Yale. I am so proud of you guys. And it is just a special feeling, and I'm sure there are a lot of them here. But you know, being a Korean American adoptee, immigrant woman with alienation, shyness, and all this, these are incredible assets for us to be an artist. You have to be an outsider. So all this is given. It's like a free ticket to almost halfway there. You're outsider, you're elevated, you're stupid, they thought, all of this thing. But then you use all these seemingly negative things into something so wonderful like this. I'm really proud of it. I feel like my kid got a A+. This happens when you're about this old. So.
One more question. Yes.
My name's Eric. I'm actually not Korean. I'm half Taiwanese American, half my mom's from Hong Kong. But I've seen hearing the stories of all 5 of you, and sort of hearing the stories from everyone else, sort of so many parallels between the different sub-communities, and specifically Asian Americans, just in general, but even other minority groups in the U.S., but especially between East Asian cultures. I think there's so many similar histories in the last century, especially around the war situation during World War II, and a lot of the colonialism and the Japanese invasion and so on. one thing that I've noticed in the U.S. is that, at least among my generation, there's less of this idea of antagonism between, and it's sort of what Min Jin was talking about earlier about the relationship between Koreans and the Japanese, and thinking about this antagonism that sort of not disappeared, but considerably dissipated, at least in my generation. I just turned 30 this year. What do you see sort of this pan-Asian solidarity that you see in the United States, because we're sort of in this together almost, because there's just not enough of any of us, versus this tension that's still going on geopolitically in East Asia, and especially now, sort of the tensions ramping up again between North Korea and South Korea, but also between the sort of the other players in the region. And what can we do as Asian Americans to contribute to that larger conversation, both as citizens, but also maybe through writing and through art and through communication and other forms?
I can answer that. It's fine. What's your name?
Eric.
Eric. Awesome. You look so young. You don't look 65 either, by the way. And I was like, oh, what's her skincare line? But to answer Eric's question about Pan-Asian, I talk about this very often, and I'm asked to speak about it. And so I wanted to share this with you, is that I'm a very politicized person. I have always been a very politicized person. And I use a lot of my anger, which translated into amusement at this point in my life. And because I take a lot of action, I don't feel so pissed. So that really helps. But going back to this Pan-Asian identity, it's an incredibly humongous tent to be Asian American, and it's almost offensively so. So if you talk to a Latino person, they kind of laugh and go, an Ecuadorian and a Puerto Rican has nothing in common except for a colonial history, right? Because they have the shared language. And when I was living in Japan, there is no Pan-Asian identity, because if you are Korean, you could be North Korean, South Korean, or ethnically Korean and be Japanese citizen, you're still perceived to be a foreigner. And the Chinese are treated like shit in Japan, just like, because right now they're becoming a bigger group. But going back to this idea of what can we do, when like you, I would go in situations and feel very outraged at, let's say, the internment of the Japanese Americans, or the federal legislation of the Chinese Exclusion Act, which is the only federal immigration law that we've had that passed Congress like this, twice, to get rid of the Chinese, because the Chinese are considered so threatening, and they are considered threatening even today. So we have this political reality, we have this political history, I have the outrage, you may have the outrage, and yet we also have this love, like, what can we do? I believe that all of us are trying to generate radical empathy. And we generate radical empathy through art and through drama. Because what drama can do is very different than writing an essay. Because in drama, we can experience what Aristotle talks about as recognition, reversal, and catharsis. And if I can get those three things, I'm done. Like, I've made you think differently about a Korean person. I've made you think differently about a character who's troubled. It's not just an idea or a paragraph or a sad story. It becomes somebody that you realize, oh, that could be me. And I do think that Aristotle, way back then, this white Greek guy, he really knew what he was talking about. So radical empathy, I think that is what artists are trying to do.
And I think with that, we're going to wrap it up. I'm so sorry. We started a little bit late, and then we wanted to hear from all the authors. And we also wanted to leave time at the end for a little more mix and mingling. You get to meet the authors, buy their books, get them signed, use hashtag Korean American Story to tell the world how much you enjoyed our gathering tonight. And really, it couldn't have been done without all of you. This event sold out in 2 days. That was a particular point of pride for us at Korean American Story. So thank you for making it happen. And thank you to our writers.